The house was filled with a pent-up tension, as if a thread of expectation was woven into its very air, viscous, almost suffocating. It was a dazzling summer morning outside, but inside its majestic halls, covered with carpets and decorated with heavy curtains, seemed cool and dark. Ancestral paintings stared silently from the walls, as if they too were waiting for a decision to be announced. My name is Jacqueline. I am 62 years old, and I have tried all my life to be a support for my family. First, for Kyle's husband, an outstanding doctor, whose name was respected not only by colleagues, but also by numerous patients, for whom he became the embodiment of hope. Then, for Larry's son, who followed in his father's footsteps, choosing a similar path for himself, although his ambitions aspired higher, to the administrative heights. Now that my husband is gone, I feel like a tree left alone after a devastating storm. Kyle died suddenly, at the age of 65, leaving behind a rich legacy, and not only in a material sense. His farewell was an event that united hundreds of people. Colleagues, bosses, friends, even strangers who had once been his patients came to pay their respects. But, strangely enough, among the mournful faces, one stood out, devoid of even a hint of sadness. It was Julie, the wife of our eldest son. Her gaze seemed relaxed, as if her father-in-law's death was not a loss, but a deliverance. From that day on, Julie began to show interest in the inheritance. Questions about how the property would be divided came from her lips more often than words of condolence. The house, $5 million, and the position of director, all this, in her opinion, should have become a part of her life through Larry. She wasn't shy about her intentions and didn't seem to notice how her greed was leaving shadows on our family. Today seemed to be the culmination of her expectations. When the lawyer appeared in the living room, who came to read Kyle's will, Julie entered the room looking as if she already owned this house. Her footsteps sounded hollow on the parquet floor, as if she was deliberately trying to show her superiority. "You already know who will be the heir, right?" She turned to the lawyer with feigned courtesy, ignoring my presence. The old me might have retorted to her, but in recent months I've learned to look at her with quiet irony. Her greedy eyes reflected more than just a desire for wealth. It was her confidence that everything belonged to her by right. I held back my laughter until Julie turned her back on me and made another comment full of self-satisfaction. "Do you really think you're going to get something? It should all belong to Larry." This moment was a turning point for me. For too long, I've let her greed and arrogance poison the atmosphere at home. Finally, I laughed, loudly, sincerely, as if her words were the best joke I'd ever heard. The lawyer froze, his face expressing both surprise and confusion. Julie turned to me with a cold look, clearly offended by my behavior. "You're laughing because you realize that you have no right to this inheritance," she said, raising her voice. "No, honey, I'm laughing because your greed is the only thing that really belongs to you," I replied, stifling another laugh. "Larry, my son is late as usual." He entered the living room at the moment when Julie, in her pompous manner, was announcing to everyone present that the right to inherit belongs to her husband. I looked at my son, hoping to see the exhaustion of his wife's constant ambitions on his face, but instead he looked calm and detached. Perhaps he, like me, has long been used to her way of communicating. However, behind Larry's calmness, behind Julie's bitter laughter and arrogance, behind the lawyer's cold professionalism, there was something that awaited us all ahead. My suspicions were confirmed the moment I heard Julie talking to relatives around the corner of the spacious living room. Her voice was confident and loud, devoid of the restraint that I always thought should accompany a funeral. "Of course, my father-in-law always worked," she said casually. "But that doesn't mean he left us anything significant. Perhaps he was too involved in his work and just didn't think about putting it off. Although, if he was smarter, he probably saved a considerable amount. Anyway, I don't have time to waste time guessing. I hope the lawyer will clarify everything." I stood listening to her words as if in a daze. It wasn't the first time Julie had allowed herself to say such things, but to hear it at the funeral of my husband, her husband's father, was beyond my comprehension. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Julie didn't seem to care at all about the loss itself or its consequences for our family. Her thoughts were solely on how the inheritance would be divided. She didn't even seem to realize that as a daughter-in-law, she had no rights to the fortune left by my husband. Larry, my eldest son, noticed my gaze and came up to me with a guilty expression on his face. "Mom, I'm truly sorry," he muttered, lowering his voice a little. I tried to talk to her, explain that it was inappropriate, but she just wouldn't listen. I put my hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him down. "It's not your fault, Larry," I said softly. "But if you really feel responsible, could you warn her to be more restrained? There are many people here who knew and respected your father." Larry nodded, but there was impotence in his eyes. Perhaps he was already tired of the constant disagreements with Julie, her inappropriate behavior and greed. Her way of communicating always left me with a bitter aftertaste. During the preparations for the funeral, she did not offer any help, did not utter words of comfort. Instead, her interest was focused on questions that sounded cold and soulless. How much did he leave? How will it be distributed? I hope you're not going to spend everything on your whims. I remembered one of those days when it seemed to me that I was about to break down. Julie came up to me and, instead of words of support, said, "I hope you understand that this is still your husband's inheritance. So maybe you should think about not wasting it." I couldn't even find the words to answer her right away. Her sarcastic tone, her mocking looks, her constant reproaches about my age and the fact that I don't have long to live, made me alternately angry and deeply sad. Julie has always been obsessed with money. Even Larry, despite the fact that he was a successful doctor, often heard her reproach about lack of money. She could only call me to complain. "We barely have enough to live on. What if Larry loses his job? We can't live like this." I tried to offer her reasonable solutions. Maybe she should find a job and contribute to the family budget. But her reaction was always the same. "To work? The doctor's wife? This is ridiculous. Isn't that why we marry successful men in order to live in comfort?" Her selfishness and inability to appreciate her husband's work irritated me. I saw how tired Larry was after long shifts, but instead of gratitude, he received only new claims. Now that she was targeting my husband's inheritance, I felt like I had reached the limit of my patience. This house that I built with Kyle, these years of working together to leave something to our children, all of this suddenly became the subject of her endless demands and manipulations. But the most annoying thing was that, despite her statements, Julie never considered us her family. She looked down on us as if we were just a means to achieve her goals. Her behavior at the funeral was the last straw. She didn't just ignore the grief that had taken over the house, but seemed to enjoy the situation in which she could play her part. After the lawyer left, I found Julie in the library, where she was chatting animatedly with someone from distant relatives. Her voice sounded clear and loud, as if she deliberately wanted me to hear. "You know, I think my father-in-law was probably more prudent than he seems. With this level of income, he probably left something significant. It's amazing if Larry doesn't get it." "Julie," I said, walking into the room with a straight face. "Can't you just leave talking about money alone for one day?" She turned abruptly to me, her face flushed, but not from embarrassment, from irritation. "I'm sorry if this sounds incorrect, but this is an important question, isn't it?" she said with an affectation of politeness, which hid the usual insolence. I came closer, leaning on the heavy wooden back of one of the chairs. "Is it an important question?" I asked, looking her straight in the eye. "Maybe. But definitely not now, when we are burying my husband, your father-in-law." She opened her mouth as if she was going to say something, but froze when she realized that I wasn't going to back down. "You've never shown any respect for me or my husband," I continued, keeping calm. But your last words, they humiliate Kyle's memory. Do you want an inheritance? Very good. But if you think that your greed will allow you to dictate conditions or influence decisions, then you are very mistaken. Julie turned pale. She probably expected me to keep quiet, as usual, but this time I couldn't let her overstep the line. Now, if you don't mind, I added, gesturing toward the door, leave me alone with my family. A real family. She stood there for a moment, clenching her fists, but then she turned and left the room, leaving behind a slight smell of expensive perfume and a feeling of strained patience. I sat down in the armchair, allowing myself to exhale deeply. At that moment, Larry came up to me. Mom. He began softly, but I raised my hand to stop him. You don't have to explain anything to me, Larry, I said, not looking at him. Just think about how far you're willing to go for peace in your family. His eyes met mine, and I saw the pain in them. He didn't have to say anything. He knew I was right. When evening twilight began to envelop the house, filling its halls with soft twilight, I was left alone in the living room. Massive curtains hid the world outside, and the silence seemed almost tangible. The only light source was a desk lamp in the corner of the room, its warm glow reflected on the glass surface of the table on which lay Kyle's will, left by the lawyer. I looked at this document as if it were a living being capable of speaking, arguing, and even judging. His every point, home, money, position, became something of an arbiter in this ruthless struggle. For Julie it was the key to wealth and status, for Larry it was a heavy burden, for me it was a reminder that Kyle was no longer here. My thoughts were interrupted by the creaking of the door. It was Larry. He came up to me, his face was serious, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. Mom, he said, sitting down opposite her, I wanted to talk. I nodded, inviting him to continue. I know that Julie, that she's overreacting. He looked away, as if choosing his words. And I know how you feel. Do you know? I asked, a little sharply. Are you sure you understand? Because, Larry, I've been silent for too long. I was silent when she looked at us as mere suppliers of her comfort. I was silent when she spoke disparagingly about your father, the man who did everything for you. And now, after his death, she is already planning how to divide what he left. Larry raised his hands as if to defend himself from my words. Mom, I understand, believe me. I know her behavior is out of line. But I can't change it. I tried to talk to her, tried to explain, but... He paused, as if looking for an excuse. You can't change her, I agreed. But you can set boundaries. It's not just your inheritance, Larry. It's a memory of your father. His face tightened, but he didn't say anything. I continued. Larry, I don't want this inheritance to become a bone of contention between us. But I also won't allow it to be used as a manipulation tool. He nodded, but there was still confusion in his eyes. What do you want, Mom? What is it? He finally asked. I sighed. I want you to protect yourself, your family, and the legacy your father left behind. If Julie can't figure out that there's something more important in life than money, then that's her problem, not yours. Larry got up and went to the window, pulling back the curtain. The sunset was still smoldering behind the glass, turning the sky blood red. I'll think about it, Mom, he said softly, as if he was talking more to himself than to me. I looked at him, my boy, who was now a grown man, and thought about how often the people we love are held hostage by someone else's ambitions. When Larry left, I was left alone in the living room, lost in my thoughts. Shadows from the flickering light of the lamp danced on the walls, and silence finally returned. I remembered the years I spent with Kyle and how we built this life together. Everything we had was the result not only of his work, but also of our common struggle. And now it has become a bargaining chip for people who didn't know what it meant to work for something bigger than themselves. Julie wasn't the first one to make me think about how money and power change people. But she was the clearest illustration that greed can take exquisite forms. Her face, which had seemed so open at her wedding to Larry, was now frozen in an expression of constant calculation. I was trying to figure out where I made a mistake. Maybe I wasn't able to give Larry enough wisdom to see in Julie what has now become obvious to everyone. Maybe I turned a blind eye to her behavior for too long, hoping that she would change over time. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was one of Kyle's distant relatives, Mr. Grant, a man in his 60s with a good-natured face. He entered, bowing slightly, and sat down opposite me. "Jacqueline, I'm sorry to bother you," he began softly. "I wanted to say that I understand how you feel right now." I nodded, motioning for him to continue. Wills and inheritances always bring not only money, but also disagreements. I've seen this happen more than once in our family, and every time it destroyed the relationship. "Do you think this will happen to us?" I asked bluntly. "I hope not," he replied. "But what I saw today made me think. Your sister-in-law, she's too open about her intentions." "I know," I replied quietly. Mr. Grant paused, then sighed and added, "But, Jacqueline, remember, inheritance is only a material thing. And the family that you and Kyle have created is something more. If you let this money become a barrier, it will be a real loss." His words stung me. He was right. Money is just a tool that can be both a blessing and a curse. But what to do when someone uses them to destroy what we've been building for years? When Mr. Grant left, I sat in silence for a long time, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. I knew Julie wouldn't stop. Her desire to control the inheritance turned into an obsession, and I had to figure out how to protect what was left of my husband's memory. I looked at the will on the table and realized that the answers were hidden in it. I need to know exactly what Kyle left behind in order to figure out how to protect his legacy. Not for Julie, not for Larry, but so that the memory of a man who lived his life with dignity remains pure and untouchable. The house that used to be my quiet refuge was becoming more and more like a battlefield, where conflicts flared up that I could not avoid in any way. Julie never ceased to amaze with her persistence, which exceeded all reasonable limits. Her behavior became unbearable, and every time she appeared in the house brought new troubles. After her last visit, during which she easily stated that she had taken my family necklace as an inheritance advance, I felt that I had reached my limit. She did not even try to hide her act, moreover, justified it with her family closeness. But this necklace was not just an ornament, it was a memory of my mother, of those days when she wore it only on special occasions, giving it a special meaning. When Julie left, leaving behind only the smell of her expensive perfume and a feeling of complete chaos, I went to the phone. I knew that talking to Larry was unlikely to bear any fruit, but I couldn't keep silent anymore. "Larry, I'm truly sorry that I have to say this," I began, trying to contain my emotions. "But your wife crossed all possible boundaries." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard his heavy sigh. "Mom, I understand. I've already talked to her about it. She promised she wouldn't behave like that anymore." "Did you say that?" I asked, feeling my anger grow. "Larry, do you understand that these are not just her words? She stole my necklace. Do you realize that she's acting like she owns everything your father left behind?" "I know," he replied, and there was weariness in his voice. "I'll talk to her again." But one more time didn't change anything. Julie continued her pressure, now through letters and messages. I found one of these letters in our mailbox, addressed to Larry and his wife. It was not a simple envelope, but an official document with an attachment, judging by its appearance. I couldn't resist opening it. Inside was a credit card bill that Julie had somehow issued in my son's name. The amount was impressive, and I felt dizzy. That was the limit. I could no longer tolerate her manipulations and attempts to take control of everything that did not belong to her. I knew that I needed to act decisively to protect myself, my memory, and perhaps even my son from her harmful influence. I took the letter to the office and put it on the table. The next step was to talk to a lawyer, because I couldn't rely on Larry's words anymore. Julie had crossed the line, and now I was ready to defend my right to peace of mind, even if it meant using all my accumulated experience and determination. However, even as I was preparing for this fight, I couldn't get rid of the thought, why does she hate me so much? What have I done to deserve her scorn? Or was it all just a thirst for control and money? My thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was the neighbor, Mr. Bailey. "Jacqueline, I'm sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Julie was just here, saying that you wouldn't let her in the house and that she felt ostracized." His words startled me. She has already started to involve other people in this situation. Her attempts to portray me in the worst light were not just manipulation, it was a deliberate move. "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I'll deal with it." But inside, I felt a new wave of fatigue rolling in. Will this conflict be able to end peacefully? Or will Julie not stop until she destroys everything that's left of our family? The mailbox, lying under the midday sun, seemed inconspicuous, but its contents ignited a storm of indignation in me. The credit card bill addressed to Julie, already opened and brazenly placed in my mailbox, seemed to scream about her impudence. The names of expensive restaurants, luxury boutiques, and online stores flashed through the details of the expenses, where I never allowed myself to buy anything. Clutching this piece of paper, I felt my face flood with heat. My heart was beating so hard that I could barely hear my own thoughts. How dare she? Why does she think I should pay for her whims? I immediately dialed Larry's number. His voice sounded tired on the other end of the line, as if he expected the conversation to end with reproaches. "Larry, I just found Julie's credit card bill in my inbox. Can you explain to me what that means?" He paused, then answered uncertainly. "Mom, I know it's unpleasant, but we're having a hard time right now. Julie went a little overboard with the expenses, and I don't have time to pay for everything. We were hoping that you could help." His words hit me like a bolt from the blue. "Can I help you?" I asked in disbelief. "Larry, do you really think that after everything she's done, I'm going to pay her bills?" "Mom, I know this is wrong. But you've always helped." He began, trying to sound conciliatory. "Did you help?" My voice became firmer. "I helped you when you were a kid. I supported you while you were building your career. But you're a grown man now, Larry. You have a job, you have a wife. Why should I cover her lavish expenses?" "But you have an inheritance from Dad," he interrupted, and I froze, feeling everything inside me boil. "You can't spend it all anyway." These words were the last straw. "Larry," I said coldly, "it looks like you and Julie are really perfect for each other. You both know neither measure nor respect. From now on, I'm breaking off all contact with you." I hung up the phone, not listening to his excuses. Anger swept over me like a storm. How could my son have fallen so low? How could he let his wife manipulate not only him, but also me? I crumpled up the bill and threw it in the trash, feeling my hatred for Julie grow by the minute. Her behavior went beyond all imaginable boundaries. Perhaps she set it up herself by putting the bill in my mailbox, hoping that I would pay without any questions. I turned away from the window, feeling a pain in my chest. My hand went to the photo of Kyle on the dresser. His kind eyes looked at me with a smile, as if reminding me that I should hold on. "Kyle, what should I do?" I whispered, running my finger over the glass of the frame. And suddenly I remembered about the will. There, in a sealed envelope, was his last will. Maybe there was an answer there. I opened the closet and took out a document. My hands were shaking when I opened the envelope. The lines, written in the lawyer's even handwriting, revealed that my husband had provided for much more than any of us could have expected. Kyle knew that such situations could arise. He knew that Julie and her greed could be a problem. The will clearly stated that the house, money, and all property belong to me, and I have the right to dispose of them as I see fit. Moreover, there was a clause in the text regarding the fact that any claims to inheritance without my consent would be considered invalid. I clutched the document to my chest, holding back tears. "Thanks, Kyle," I whispered, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I clenched my fist, deciding that I would no longer let Larry or Julie dictate how to live my life. Now I'm going to act. It's time to restore order and show them that the mother should not be treated like a puppet. Julie stood in the doorway, as if absorbing her entire smug image, from head to toe. She entered the house as if it was already her territory, with an expression of absolute confidence on her face. I watched her from the couch, pretending to be deep in paperwork, but actually preparing for the moment I had been waiting for since the day the will was read. The lawyer sitting across from me looked at her with mild surprise, but maintained his professional restraint. Julie ignored me and walked straight towards him, as if we hadn't known each other for a long time. "Oh, you must be a lawyer," she began with a deliberately courteous tone. "I'm Julie, Larry's wife. You probably already know that my husband is the eldest son, which means that the inheritance should fairly be ours." She spoke quickly, with an enthusiasm that sounded like admiration for herself. I watched her without interrupting her monologue, feeling a smile spread across my lips. "We've been waiting for this moment for so long," she continued. "A house, $5 million, and, of course, the position of director. It should belong to Larry because he's the eldest son. It's obvious, isn't it?" Her words, spoken with such confidence, caused a sudden burst of laughter in me. He burst out of me unexpectedly, loud and sincere, filling the room. I could barely contain myself, holding my stomach, as if I had heard the best joke of my life. Julie's face was frozen in a mixture of indignation and surprise. "Hey, what's so funny?" "What is it?" she asked coldly. "Isn't it obvious?" "Oh, Julie," I replied, wiping away tears of laughter. "You really believe that you know how things are?" Her eyes narrowed and her lips formed a narrow line. "You just don't want to admit the obvious," she said. "Your husband was a doctor. He worked for so many years. Of course, he must have enough money left." I laughed again, but this time my laughter was quieter, as if I enjoyed her naivety more than her words. "Yes, Julie, my husband was a doctor. And he was an incredibly prudent man. Do you know what the most interesting thing is? He not only left an inheritance, but also provided for every possible scenario in his will." At these words, I noticed how the lawyer put his hand on the documents, preparing for an important moment. Julie, however, continued to look at me as if she was confident of her victory. "Now," I said, raising an eyebrow, "why don't you sit down and listen to how things really are?" Her smug smile faded slightly, but she obeyed anyway, sinking into the chair opposite. The lawyer, restraining his expression, began to read out the will. According to the will of the late Kyle H. Wilson, all property, including the house, savings, and business, is completely transferred to the disposal of his wife, Jacqueline Wilson. The lawyer's voice was clear and ruthless. I saw Julie turn pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Moreover, the lawyer continued, "The will notes that any attempts to challenge this decision will be considered grounds for depriving the rights to any possible assistance from the heirs." Julie opened her mouth, but didn't say a word. Her face expressed genuine shock. I smiled at her. "You know, Julie," I said in a soft voice, "sometimes it's better to keep quiet before demanding something that never belonged to you." Her eyes flashed, but she couldn't answer anything. Now, finally, all the cards have been revealed. The room froze in tense silence. Julie was still standing in front of me, clutching the stolen necklace in her fingers as a symbol of her imaginary victory. Larry entered the house late, as usual, his face showing a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. But I knew that this was the face of a man who was used to finding excuses, both for himself and for others. Julie broke the silence first. "The right to inherit belongs to Larry," she blurted out loudly, her voice sounding like a battle cry. I took a deep breath, feeling anger mixed with bitterness. It was time to tell the truth, which had been hidden for a long time behind the facade of their pretensions and greed. "As you can see," I began firmly, "you two shouldn't have any claims on the inheritance." Larry frowned, and his voice cracked as he asked, "Mom, what do you mean?" "Oh, you really don't understand?" I could barely contain the sarcastic tone that was asking to come out. "Have you forgotten something?" "Wait, Larry, you do understand the situation I'm talking about, right? Or do you, as always, think that if you close your eyes, the problems will disappear?" Julie looked at me with sincere bewilderment, as if her memory had suddenly disappeared. "What is she talking about?" "What is it?" she asked, looking at Larry. He opened his mouth to say something, but I beat him to it. "Let me refresh your memory," I said, getting up from my seat. "Larry married you, Julie, a few years ago. But before that, he had another family, a wife and a child. And he left them in order to marry you." The words fell into the room like a stone into a quiet lake. Julie turned pale, but her eyes were burning. "Larry, what does this mean?" "What is it?" she asked, turning to him. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "It was a long time ago, and I have already solved this problem." "Have you decided?" I asked, bitterness in my voice. "You came to your father, begging him to help you pay alimony and support your son because you couldn't cope on your own." I met Julie's gaze, and there was something like panic in her eyes. "Kyle," I continued, "my husband, your father, Larry, couldn't believe that you could leave your child for a new relationship." "Mom, I didn't leave," he began, but I interrupted him. "Oh, I quit, and how else? And then your father told you that he would not support you. But he supported your son so that the boy would not suffer because of a father like you." I saw Larry start to lose his temper, but he couldn't object. It was all true, bitter, and immutable. "He told you at the same time, Larry, that you couldn't expect to inherit. He made it clear, someone who abandons his family deserves neither respect nor celebration." Julie clenched her fists, her face turned to stone. "It was a long time ago," she murmured, but her voice was trembling. "A long time ago, yes. But that doesn't change the fact that your union, Larry and Julie, was built on destruction from the very beginning. And now you dare to claim the inheritance?" I turned to the lawyer, who was watching the whole scene with professional composure, although his eyes expressed mild surprise. "Julie, you're saying that my husband was a doctor who earned money, and now it should belong to Larry. Are you laughing at me?" "It's obvious," she blurted out. "Your husband had so much money, he couldn't even spend it." I laughed. It wasn't just laughter, it was a mixture of relief and rage. "Julie, you don't know anything. You have no idea how much of my work went into what Kyle and I had. And you think you can come here and get it?" I clenched my fists, feeling confidence overwhelm me. "So I'll tell you both what," I said. "Neither you, Julie, nor you, Larry, will get a dime of what Kyle left. Everything we had belongs only to me." And finally, I felt a long-awaited relief. There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by the barely audible rustle of paper, which the lawyer carefully folded into an envelope after reading the will. Larry sat staring into space, his face colorless, as if the earth had gone from under his feet. Julie, on the other hand, was like a flame burning with indignation and anger. "This is simply unthinkable," she exclaimed, jumping up from her seat. "This is some kind of mistake." I folded my hands in my lap, allowing myself a faint, barely noticeable smile. "Julie, you heard what the lawyer said," I said, trying to keep my voice soft but firm. "The will was drawn up by my husband with full understanding of what he was doing." Her eyes darted to me, full of indignation. "But Larry is his son. It's unnatural. How could he leave everything to you?" "Perhaps," I began, without looking away, "this is due to the fact that Larry, as an adult man, repeatedly violated his father's trust. Have you thought about it?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands trembled. But, she began to stutter, then turned to a lawyer. "Sir, you don't understand. It must be a misunderstanding. My husband is the eldest son. Doesn't that give him the right?" The lawyer, who had been calm all this time, raised his eyes and spoke in an even voice. "Mrs. Julie, the will was drawn up in compliance with all legal norms. Your spouse, despite being the eldest son, was excluded from the inheritance. This is your father-in-law's decision, and it will be impossible to challenge it, given the available documents." Julie froze for a moment, digesting what she had heard. Then her gaze fell on the necklace that hung around her neck, like a reminder of her arrogance. "And this?" I asked, pointing to the jewelry. "Do you really think you can take even what belongs to me?" She yanked the necklace sharply, as if wanting to protect it, but realizing the futility of her position, she took it off and threw it in my direction. "Take it away," she shouted, her face flushed with anger. The necklace fell to the floor in front of me. I calmly picked it up and put it on the table, feeling a sense of long-awaited triumph of justice rising in my soul. "Thank you, Julie," I said with a slight smile. "Now, please leave my house." She didn't move, but her gaze was directed at Larry, who seemed to have lost the ability to speak. "Larry, aren't you going to say anything?" she almost hissed. "Are you going to let your mother treat us like this?" He finally raised his head, but his face expressed only emptiness. "What can I say, Julie?" he muttered. "My father decided everything long before his death. It's all because of you," she shouted, her voice trembling. "You didn't do anything to convince him. You couldn't." Her words echoed in the room until she turned around and headed for the door. I watched her go, feeling the tension begin to ease. When the door slammed shut, I turned to the lawyer. "Thank you for your work," I said sincerely. "It is my duty, madam," he replied, standing up. Larry, who was still sitting at the table, looked defeated. "Mom, I didn't know," he began, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Larry, this is not the time to explain. Perhaps when you learn to take responsibility for your actions, we will have a conversation." He nodded, lowering his head, and a minute later he also left, leaving me alone. I walked slowly to the window and looked out at the garden, illuminated by the evening sun. There was a calmness inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Everything fell into place. Kyle, my husband, did everything to protect me even after his death. I clutched the necklace to my chest as a symbol of our common struggle and memory of him. It was our victory. She ran out of the house, and her face was so red, as if a boil had exploded on it, incredibly sinister and inflamed. I watched her leave with Larry, their silhouettes disappearing into the evening shadows as soon as they left the gate. I was clutching a necklace in my hands, a symbol of something deeply personal and valuable that she seemed to take for granted, but which has now become a symbol of my victory. My fist tapped softly on the table, as if in triumph. It seemed that this gesture shook the air, by itself giving an answer to all questions. After that moment, Julie never tried to contact me or visit our house again. The hereditary procedures ended so smoothly that it was hard for me to believe that all this drama, which seemed so restless and confusing, was now behind me. In addition, I was worried all the time that they might run into Larry's ex-wife, the woman with whom he had another child. However, Larry, who did not even pay alimony, did not know her contact details. Therefore, despite all my fears, I realized that there would be no problems, and their participation in the cases was minimal. It seems that Larry and Julie had a big fight with each other. Even my victory was not a complete triumph, because, as I found out, Julie told her husband that, they say, I married him only for the sake of a huge inheritance from his father. They are obviously on the verge of divorce. And this was probably the most logical consequence of their relationship, because, as folk wisdom says, the end of money is the end of love. Everything became clearer than ever when Larry finally wrote me a single message full of indignation: "Give me the money or the house you inherited." I just ignored his request. Why waste time on him? I replied angrily, unable to restrain myself, "Don't talk nonsense while you're awake," and immediately hung up the phone, although she couldn't help but feel the bitterness in her chest. Where did I go wrong in bringing up this man, whose actions seemed to be constantly on the verge of being reasonable and decent? However, in the midst of all this chaos, unexpected news came. Surprisingly, it was good news, and it came in a letter from Larry's ex-wife. The letter was brief, but very warm. It informed me that all inheritance procedures had been completed, and next to the dry completion notice was a photo of my sweet grandson. She, as a caring woman, thanked us for being such wonderful grandparents. It was an amazing message. After reading it, I felt my heart filled with warmth and joy. The letter said that their family is now happy, and my grandson is growing up healthy and happy with a new father. This picture of them all smiling, sitting together on the green grass, became some kind of bright spot in the dark story of Larry in his clumsy attempts to get what did not belong to him. The letter was so sincere and full of love that I couldn't help but read it to my husband right away. I went over to his desk, where he was sitting looking through some papers, and handed him a letter with a photo. The smile that I had wanted to see for so long instantly appeared on his face, and I realized that it was not just a smile of happiness, it was an appreciation deeply rooted in the way he treated his grandson. We sat with our arms around each other, discussing the future, and I felt his love warming me like the sun rising to chase away the darkness of the night. I can't say that I was completely satisfied with everything that happened, or that I completely got rid of the disappointment that Larry's actions caused. But this letter, this moment when I could convey the good news to my husband, became the bright spot that illuminated my path. He and I decided that it is still possible to be happy, even if others do not understand our decisions and choices. Now that I looked at this photo, I could tell myself that I had done everything right, despite the mistakes, despite the pain that life sometimes brings. Anyway, there are things in the world that are more important than money and power, and maybe at that moment I felt that I had found something more valuable: love and family, real and without any conventions.